Hey, once again, good afternoon and welcome to our Power event. Welcome to the Strengthening Canadian Systems to Prevent GBV, to prevent GBV among racialized migrant women. This is a virtual Power event as part of the NGO CSW70 forum, and it aims to explore effective strategies to prevent gender-based violence and support survivors in Canada, drawing on research, frontline practice, and policy lessons. I am your host, Tomilola John, the Community Health Programs Manager at Women's Health in Women's Hands Community Health Center. We are a Toronto-based community health center that provides culturally safe, relevant, and responsive health services and programs to racialized women, trans, and non-binary individuals from the African, Caribbean, Black, Latin American, and South Asian communities. Today, our expert panelists will present evidence-based interventions across the lifespan, sharing insights from a GBV prevention and care cascade model, and underscore the urgent need for policy reform and sustained funding for community-based cultural responsive programming. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping rules. Please keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking during the Q&A session to avoid background noise. We encourage everyone to use the chat or Q&A function to ask questions at any time. These questions will be addressed during the Q&A session. If you encounter any technical issues during this Zoom webinar, check your internet connection or exit and rejoin the session. Lastly, this webinar will be recorded and will be shared with those who are unable to join us today. We will begin this virtual event with a brief introduction to the topic of discussion, followed by the introduction of our panelists. Each panelist will present for 15 minutes, followed by a roundup with key takeaways. Our final 30 minutes Q&A session will be facilitated by Mame Antwi. She is the Community Engagement and Outreach Coordinator at Women's Health in Women's Hands Community Health Center. Mame is a global health graduate and community health advocate dedicated to advancing equitable care and for Black and racialized women, Black and racialized communities. She works closely with youth, service providers, and policymakers to address mental health inequities and anti-Black racism in healthcare. Her work centers on culturally safe care, mental wellness, and accessible sexual health services across the Greater Toronto area. She is deeply committed to creating spaces where individuals feel seen, heard, and empowered to advocate for their health. For today's discussion, we use the term woman inclusively to refer to cisgender women, non-binary individuals, and two-spirit people. Migrant women are defined as those who have crossed borders, whether by choice or under compulsion, and whose immigration status may include permanent residency, refugee, or asylum-seeking status, temporary permits, or even those who might lack legal status. So with only 4 years remaining until 2030, the world is still far from achieving the goal of eliminating all forms of violence against women and girls in both public and private spheres. This includes ending trafficking, sexual and other forms of exploitation, and harmful practices such as child early or forced marriages, as well as female genital mutilation or cutting. Progress towards gender equality has slowed, and the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic have pushed global efforts even further off track. Violence against women and girls remains widespread and is increasing in many countries, affecting women of all ages. According to the UN data, in 2018, more than 1 in 4 ever partnered women aged 15 or older, which is an estimated of 641 million women worldwide, had experienced some kind of physical and or sexual violence from an husband or intimate partner at least once in their lifetime. The most recent data shows that this figure has risen nearly to 1 in 3 women globally who have experienced physical and or sexual violence at least once in their lifetime. Within the Canadian context, women, girls, and gender diverse people are at the higher risk of experiencing gender-based violence, often compounded by additional discrimination and barriers they face, especially for those from racial or ethnic minority communities. Experiences of gender-based violence might have begun before migration, but studies have shown that migration itself plays a significant role in the risk of violence after their arrival. Factors that influence migratory risk and heighten immigrant women's vulnerability to violence include precarious migratory status, significant changes in um, financial and living conditions, loss of social networks and supports, challenges related to social integration, clashes with cultural norms and practices, language barriers, and a lack of adequate understanding and information about the laws, structures, and services in Canada. So here are some facts. Experiences of gender-based violence among migrant women in Canada is underreported, and according to the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, there are limited statistics on newcomer populations, including refugees, asylum seekers, and many studies do not report specific demographics or focus mainly on immigrants. So based on the data that is available, here's what we have learned about the impact of gender-based violence in Canada. From 2011 to 2021, an average of 102 women and girls were victims of gender-related homicide per year in Canada. Rates of intimate partner violence and family violence have steadily increased over the past 5 years. 1 in 4 visible minority immigrant women have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime. 20% of immigrant women have reported a sexual assault experience. And according to 2020 data, every 2.5 days, a woman or girl is killed in a violent homicide in Canada. In 2009, the economic impact of spousal violence in Canada reached $7.4 billion, equivalent to $220 for each Canadian. This figure encompasses various costs, including hospital visits, admission, loss of productivity, property damage, the operations of social services, and the long-term effects on children. In the same year, the economic impact of assault victimization was estimated to be $2.1 billion, while sexual assault and other sexual offenses accounted for $4.8 billion cost. Unfortunately, no updated national cost estimates have been released. However, given the documented rise in gender-based violence over the past 5 years, it is reasonable to expect that the financial burden has increased significantly. Lastly, in 2017, Canada announced a $100 million investment to support initiatives and programs aimed at preventing gender-based violence and assisting victims and survivors, as well as their families, and to promote a responsive justice system. This investment was followed by another $539 million commitment in 2022. So since 2017, over $820 million has been invested in the federal strategy to combat gender-based violence. And from a global standpoint, Canada does continue to establish international partnerships aimed at preventing gender-based violence, supporting survivors and their families. So today we are joined by 3 panelists with extensive experience in the field of gender-based violence. Our panelists will explore what is needed to eliminate gender-based violence and achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Our first presentation will be delivered by Dr. Bilkis Vizanji. She is a professor and researcher at the Faculty of Nursing and the Center of Public Health at the University of Montreal. Her work focuses on global and migrant women's health, gender-based violence, including female genital mutilation and cutting, and health equity. She collaborates with Women's Health in Women's Hands, as well as other community-based partners in Canada, in Quebec and across Canada, and also internationally. She will discuss the challenges of addressing gender-based violence in migration context. She will emphasize the importance of health professionals, recognizing that vulnerability often arises from structural conditions, such as precarious immigration status, language barriers, discrimination, and economic dependencies. Her talk will highlight the need for ethical, trauma-informed care that prioritizes safety, confidentiality, informed consent, culturally safe referrals, and respect for survivor autonomy. Our second panel presentation will be delivered by Ziana Findlay. She is the gender-based violence counselor, case manager, and community educator based in Canada with over 7 years of experience supporting survivors across Toronto, Peel, York, and Durham regions. Her work focuses on trauma and violence-informed care, survivor-centered counseling, and strengthening systems that improve access to support for women experiencing violence. In 2025, she supported the development and implementation of a gender-based violence care Cascade pilot program here at Women's Health and Women's Hands, where she developed trauma-informed case management workflow to reduce service fragmentation and improve coordination of care for providers. Today, she will present on the innovative service delivery approaches to addressing gender-based violence among racialized immigrant, refugee, and newcomer women who are experiencing gender-based violence. She will be drawing on the experiences from the GBV prevention and care cascade model here at Women's Health and Women's Hands. And her presentation will highlight how to integrate culturally grounded systems in strengthening prevention and care. Our final panel presentation will be delivered by Dr. Mercy Gichuki. She is the Director of Social Services at Roots Community Services and an affiliate of McMaster University's School of Global Health and Social Medicine. She is a scholar, practitioner, grounded in Afrocentric and decolonizing frameworks. She advances culturally responsive, trauma-informed, and community-led approaches that centers dignity, reciprocity, and self-determination within the African, Caribbean, and Black communities. Her presentation will focus on how Canadian systems can deepen alignment between policy, commitments, and lived realities, particularly for racialized women. The goal is to contribute constructively to global dialogue by identifying policy pathways that translate intersectional committees and measurable prevention outcomes. Mercy's leadership bridges policy, program design, and frontline practice to strengthen equitable service delivery rooted in lived experiences and cultural knowledge. So I will now hand it over to our first presenter, Dr. Bilkis Fisanji.
Thank you very much, Tomilola. Apologies, just looking for all these little switches. Thank you very much for inviting me to this important event. Thank you to Women's Health and Women's Hands for organizing these reflections on the importance of addressing GBV. As a healthcare professional, I do come with the perspective of trying to discuss with you today in my 12 minutes that's allocated to me to sort of make a point about the fact that migration context, so one of the structural determinants of health, is affecting a number of women when it comes to accessing to human rights-based trauma and violence-informed and anti-discriminatory approach to care. My responsibility as a healthcare worker is to, and as a healthcare professional who teaches in the university and in various settings in the clinical arena, is to discuss with our healthcare professionals, the current ones and the next generation, the importance of understanding what the notion of vulnerability may be. So the next slide, of course, please. And to sort of, identify the fact that when we talk about being a healthcare professional, we have a duty that is to understand what human rights framework is, that we are not just neutral observers as healthcare professionals, but we do have our approach being grounded in human rights principles and core ethical pillars. We are at CSW70 at this point. Women's Health and Women's Hands have done tremendous work, and my colleague Zayana will be presenting that as we move on in terms of the accomplishments and what it means to actually integrate and address safety, confidentiality, informed consent, culturally safe referrals. And maybe you can go to the next slide for me, please. And looking at what structures of vulnerability may be, what do we mean by that? The fact that when we talk about being healthcare professionals, addressing an issue, responding to gender-based violence or practices, We need to be understanding those structures and the situations of vulnerability, and that they are produced by structural conditions. In other words, when we talk about a person being, we often use, I would say, the notion that a person is vulnerable. My argument today to you is that if we are thinking about anti-discriminatory, human rights-based approach in addressing GBV, and you will see examples that my colleagues will present after my presentation, is that we are not neutral observers, as I indicated. We are duty bearers, but we also need to understand that when we intervene not on the person that we call vulnerable. So we should not be calling them vulnerable, but we are discussing the context. When we talk about situations of vulnerability, which are produced by structural conditions, those are the very conditions that we're trying to work at and implement what we call trauma and violence informed care to understand how past experiences of violence, displacement, discrimination may have affected. Next slide, please. And that's why it's important that in terms of clinical implications, we're looking at trauma-informed ethical assessment, and that we're not just focusing on symptoms, but rather looking at what our ethical obligation is in terms of providing the right care, and that's informed. And the point is that when we talk about then a vulnerable person, it wouldn't work if we were to wanting to address what it means to be sensitive to the conditions. So that's why I'm talking about an ethical obligation and not an optional approach. And that sort of brings us to the next slide, where I would like to, for instance, give an explanation, an example of language. Um, when we talk about the conditions within which a person is in a situation that would need help, one of the very first obligation we have in our deontological responsibility is to communicate with the person, is to be able to establish trust relationships, especially when they've had issues of being exposed to violence. And the one way to do so is definitely to speak to the person, to be able to understand what their situation is, and for them to understand what we are saying. And that's why I'm bringing here as an example language. Language is a professional obligation when we want to establish trust in this trauma-informed approach. That language is not just being able to talk, to communicate. It is an ethical responsibility to provide a situation where the person can trust us and can communicate in a safety manner. So for instance, when we talk about literacy, how do I navigate? Organizations like Women's Health and Women's Hands provide health navigation. We'll have examples with Diana in just a minute. And those are the structural solutions that we need to address when we talk about structural condition. So in this message of my slide is to indicate that language, it could be words, it could be a touch, are an imperative in terms of our ethical care. It's not just, providing and accommodating. Next slide, please. So the example I'd like to bring in, and I'd like to renew again my sincere thanks to Women's Health and Women's Hands to have been a co-investigator, a co-researcher, a partner in the project that was funded by the European Commission almost 5 years ago now, RHC for FGC GenderNet, respectful healthcare for women in their need of respectful healthcare. So we've been working on looking at the challenges for healthcare professionals of what is it when we talk about female genital mutilation, cutting, even the words itself. The words themselves are full of definition of posture. When I say, this is a woman who has been cut, just by saying that, we are demonstrating a posture of who we are as healthcare professional. So we need to rethink. We need to have reflective questions as to what kind of violence, what kind of trauma that person went through, what are the possible impacts, what are the diverse experiences that the person went through from the very moment when that trauma was inflicted. And the notion of being a survivor as well is very important. So here I'm trying to bring the importance of what it means to offer dignified care. So dignity needs to be in the forefront. When we talk about examination, the very example of the vaginal exam just for preventive care, it is a gesture of re-trauma potentially. We need to discuss with the person as to how do I proceed? Can you accompany me in a way that I can do this so that I am respectful of your dignity? And how will I then, after, document my behavior in terms of what the trauma was when it comes to the way I engage in a conversation? We cannot just say, oh, you're coming from a country where they practice FGMC, you must be cut. Those are, in a way, words that could directly re-traumatize. We need to understand, we need to learn, we need to document, we need to be able to discuss with the person, and then we need to make sure that the words that the person themselves want to use are the right words. So the next slide, please. And that brings us to our legal framework where we have a responsibility in terms of addressing fear, especially after coming from countries where there is a legal framework that prevents FGMC, but it's not applied. Coming to Canada, it is applied. We find that, we need to be informed. What are those legal policies? We know that it's criminalized in Canada, but how does it um, come about in my clinical responsibility? How do I disclose? How do I make sure that they don't fear that I'm going to report them to youth protection? What are the intersections in terms of the various immigration experiences? So again, when we talk about trauma informed, we need to be able to understand those experiences. Next slide, please. And our responsibility is to make sure that we protect the children at risk, that we respect our women, adults, family groups who are surviving in their autonomy, in the way they do perceive that particular gender-based violence, and of course, to avoid criminalizing, because it is important to know that we do have mandatory responsibilities when it comes to suspicion of risk. But the word risk in and of itself is a danger, because we feel like we are labeling the community that they are at risk, meaning because you come from a country where that happens, you must be ingrained and you must be someone who's going to do it again, not leaving any space for the person to reflect, to understand the context, to protect the person. So the next slide, please. It is important that we understand clearly and with transparency what are the limits of our confidentiality, what are the understanding of what their experiences are, to emphasize protection, not punishment, to avoid language that may stigmatize. And those are examples that I'm giving to something that might seem obvious, but it creates that sensation of trust or lack thereof. And we cannot, repeat enough our responsibility in that respect, especially when we talk about deontology of our care towards these women. And today in 2026, we feel like it is still important to remind our responsibility to that expect to that outcome, and also the fact that when we come and seek care, we're not criminalizing, we're not immigration enforcement uh, persons. We are ethical, clinical, responsible caregivers. Next slide, please. And that is why we want to introduce the fact that we're giving ethical, trauma-informed, justice-oriented care. And these examples will be provided to you by by my colleague in the next presentation. The importance of advocacy, importance of institutional inclusive reform that we need to continue and discuss at CSW70. It's been 70 years, and still we're discussing institutional inclusive reforms. So we need to continue and challenge those practices that would put women into an inequitable position, and support community-led prevention. My next and last slide is to provide these questions to you as I finish about reflective ethical practice. It is continuous. Yeah, it's been so many years, but we need to continue and discuss with the policymakers, the program developers, that we need to interpret these various conditions of vulnerability with a strength-based lens, that we create safe conditions for disclosure, that we advocate upstream and make sure that we are understanding the challenges of informed consent when it comes to exposure to GBV. Thank you very much. And I will pass on the mic to my colleague, Zayana.
Thank you, Bill Keys, for that. And today I'll be presenting on service delivery models. So service delivery solutions to gender-based violence. If you can go back to the first slide. Good afternoon, CSW70 participating representatives, organization, and UN organizers. My name is Diana Finley, and today I have the pleasure of representing Women's Health and Women's Hands Community Health Center, based in downtown Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And my contribution focuses on service delivery solutions to gender-based violence, and specifically the development and implementation of our GBV prevention and care cascade model, designed specifically for racialized, immigrant, refugees, newcomer, and non-status women in Canada. Next slide, please. Now for the global context and intersectional risk of scope of gender-based violence. Over the past 5 years, especially post-pandemic, gender-based violence has intensified globally. From what we have seen is intensification of gender-based violence risk at the intersections of gender, migration, racialization, and structural vulnerabilities. For specifically Canadian service gaps, we wanted to address 5 key points on why service deliveries must change. First is in migrant receiving countries like Canada, racialized immigrant, refugee, newcomer, and non-status women face a lot more heightened and compounded risk. And these risks are not accidental, as violence does not just occur in isolation. It is often shaped by the intersecting systems that women must access in order to navigate systems in order to be able to survive gender-based violence. And secondly, we realized that GBV risk increase where gender inequality intersects with migration status, policies, and racializations. And at Women's Health and Women's Hands Community Health Center, through the GBV Care Cascade pilot, we were able to see barriers related to many women facing economic dependency, some language gaps, legal precarity, community and cultural stigma around disclosure, as well as social isolation, which made help seeking feel unsafe, not just difficult for these survivors and these groups. Third, we were able to see that we found services exist, but the pathways for individuals to navigate getting into those systems did not exist. as many of the GBV systems are often crisis-driven, fragmented, and a lot of the times short-term funded. Fourth, for many newcomer women, help seeking is not only emotionally difficult, it can also feel structurally unsafe with systems that aren't necessarily culturally designed for migrant realities. And real life concerns around fear of deportation, child welfare involvement, community backlash, and loss of financial stability can most of the time outweigh the perceived safety of disclosure. So this means that our preventions and response systems must be intentionally designed for these realities, not assumed to work for them, and every survivor or victim's lived experience, which is very unique based on each individual. And lastly, we've seen that women are not failing to seek help. Systems are failing to hold them through the full continuum of care and prevention. So we decided to ask ourselves a different question. What if gender-based violence prevention and care followed a structured, coordinated model similar to successful public health initiatives? Next slide, please. Before explaining the model, I want to pause on what streamlining services actually means in a survivor's real life. For every person who seeks support from your organization, whether that's by calling, texting, or using your TTY, so teletypewriter, so those will be for individuals that are either hearing or visually impaired, your clicks your hotline, clicks your website, or joins a virtual session, may be doing so at the only moment they have access to safety. This may be the only time they can leave the home or place that they are, the only moment their abuser, partner, family, or caregiver is not present, the only time of day that they can access the internet, phone, or TTY services, the only private or accessible space that they can find. For some, you may be the first person that they have ever disclosed to. For others, you may be the last person that they ever decide to reach out to. Not because they didn't or don't want help anymore, but because they have spent months and years being moved from one service to another service due to funding cycle endings, program closures, cold referrals, wait lists, and repeated re-traumatization. So that moment when someone is reaching out is not routine for a victim or a survivor. And again, we're using the term victim and survivor because some individuals do not look at themselves as survivors yet, and some individuals still do see themselves as victims. This is for them a high risk and high courage moment for them to be reaching out for that support. So streamlining service is not only efficiency, it is about safety, dignity, trust, and continuity of care for victims and survivors. Making integration not technical, it is a survivor's protection strategy. So every first contact must be treated as potentially the only contact that person has to reach out. Next slide, please. So this understanding shaped our GBV prevention and care cascade. At Women's Health in Women's Hands, we adopted lessons from an over 5-year deliverance of an HIV and care cascade model, which is a public health approach that works because it creates defined entry points, structured linkage, pathways, retention strategies, as well as accountability. And for our GBV care cascade, we focused on 3 main pillars. Our first pillar focused on prevention and education via our community engagement by way of our peer leaders that go into the communities to provide workshops offering open discussions that are community and survivor-led, which creates more room for stigma reduction as well as cultural and norm changes within communities. Our second pillar focused on streamlining services. So initial entry screening with introduction meetings, safety and risk management assessments, as well as rapid warm referrals to negate re-traumatization. And our third and last pillar focused on holistic survivor-centered treatment, support, and long-term care that supported wraparound care, meeting the clients where they are. And most importantly, the model goes beyond immediate safety planning. It addresses 2 key concepts of the Cascade pillars, which is streamlining wraparound services through our warm referrals with consent to share information with the other services survivors may require in order to make it truly wraparound care, and also the integration of mental health, housing, immigration, religious supports, spiritual supports, income security, legal advocacy, cultural recovery and trauma recovery, and long-term well-being, making the Cascade structured, but it's also very flexible because survivors' journeys aren't linear, as all GBV models require that level of flexibility to truly be able to meet survivors where they are and their individual unique lived experiences with gender-based violence. Next slide, please. So this community-driven implementation, this model was built through survivor leadership and community consultation, which included a 12-member advisory group and trained peers from African, Caribbean, Black, Latin American, and South Asian communities. These were also the communities of the individuals that were able to access care through the GBV Care Cascade model. If there are individuals that reached out for supports that did not meet this requirement, they were warm referral to another agency that can meet their requirements for support. Our peer leaders delivered prevention programming, which was able to reduce stigma and increase trust. Survivor ownership proved essential as it improved engagement and credibility. The peer leaders in the Cascade not only identified culturally to the individuals in the program, but they also lived within the communities that they were servicing, which allowed them the unique opportunity to also be able to design the programs based on the needs that they heard and seen within the communities with a cultural lens attached to it, which further shows the importance of building supports geared to communities being served. We also developed a culturally adapted GBV risk management screening and entry tool to support safe self-referrals into the Cascade, as well as referrals from partnering and other agencies and organizations. Once a client experiences gender-based violence connects with our services, they are reminded that supports remain available whenever they are ready to engage, even if they need to step away for a period of time. Clients are informed that their case management plan can be adapted at any stage, recognizing that circumstances and safety changes and that they can reach out at any time, even without an appointment, because our approach prioritizes meeting survivors where they are and responding in a way that protects their safety as well. Next slide, please. During the GBV Care Cascade pilot, the evidence that we've seen was we were able to reach over 8,000 individuals through community engagement prevention activities, as well as service pathways. Over 1,000 women and women-identified individuals accessed our GBV risk assessment tool, and also over 200 survivors and women at high risk of violence received intensive holistic case management services. With the 200 number, there are also individuals that seeked support, but because of the support that they needed and interactions that they've had with systems before, their numbers are not included in this because their numbers and information was not able to be placed in systems because of other safety issues they've had before. This was achieved through a range of prevention and community engagement strategies, including our GBV workshops for service providers and organizations, peer-led webinars, kitchen table talks, digital storytelling initiatives, podcasts, and the development of multilingual educational resources that were made for each community. So African, Black, Caribbean, Latin American, and South Asian communities as well. In terms of outcomes, the kitchen table talk demonstrated 80% positive results, including increased awareness of gender-based violence, a strong understanding of healthy relationships, and increased confidence and self-advocacy among participants. For those receiving case management, outcomes included improved safety and protection, stabilization of mental health, increased survivor agency and self-advocacy, sustained independence after exiting service, and greater readiness for long-term safety and stabilization, as well as many survivors describing experiencing a shift from moving from immediate crisis survival to the ability to plan for their future. Overall, several key service delivery lessons emerge. Trust functions as a critical infrastructure within GBV support systems. Relationship-based practices strengthen engagement and retention. Flexibility improves safety outcomes. Warm referrals help prevent re-traumatization, and culturally grounded leadership plays an essential role in reducing stigma and strengthening community trust. And my next and last slide, please. Now for policy, funding, and system implementations. So despite strong outcomes from our case management, including increased safety, mental health stabilization, strengthening survivor agency, and readiness for long-term independency, significant structural barriers remain. These include severe shelter shortages, housing inaccessibility, funding instability, long wait lists, language barriers, economic dependency, and the complexities of immigration status. Service initiatives such as the GBV Care Cascade model cannot compensate for structural under-resourcing. When GBV programs are treated as potential options or temporary funding priorities, the cost does not disappear. It multiplies across healthcare, justice, housing, education, child welfare, and income support. If only one individual experiences gender-based violence, that cost to the system over the span of 20 years is hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars to support one individual because of the structural under-resourcing. Prevention and coordinated care are not only ethical investments, they are fiscal strategies. At the same time, funding instability erodes trust. When programs appear and disappear based on grant cycles, survivors learn that systems are unreliable and unworthy of trust. Continuity of care is not a luxury in gender-based violence response. It is a safety requirement. When policies, research, and service delivery align with the lived realities of migrant women, prevention becomes possible. When communities lead, engagement grows. When services are culturally grounded, trust increases. And when care is structured, outcomes improve, and trust between systems, survivors, and communities are able to start being rebuilt. Ending gender-based violence begins with addressing inequalities. But it succeeds through intentional, survivor-centered, culturally responsive, and community-based services designed and delivery. Thank you. And I'll pass it on now to Dr. Mercy.
Thank you so much, Zayana. And good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here at the CSW70 and to join this distinguished group of delegates, advocates, and experts committed to advancing gender equality and ending gender-based violence globally. So I want to begin by acknowledging the leadership and knowledge of racialized and Black feminist thinkers whose perspectives guide much of the work I'll share today. Their insights remind us that policy is not just about inclusion in principle, it's about measurable equity and accountability in practice. So today I'll be joining from you can see me? One second. Are folks able to see me now?
We can, but you're a bit unclear. There you go.
You found me now?
Yes. And
Okay,
your
perfect.
computer is blocking a bit, but we can still see you.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's better.
Perfect.
Okay, thank
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Bilkis. I appreciate it. So today I'll be joining from the unceded territories of Mi'kmaq, and I'll be walking us through some of the persistent barriers in Canada's GBV response, the policy lens required to address them, structural inequities that remain, and concrete policy actions that can transform outcomes for all women, and particularly racialized and migrant women, as Zayana has highlighted towards the end. So I want you to imagine a system where gender-based violence is addressed not only as a crime, but as a structural failure, where race, migration status, and gender do not determine access to safety, justice, or care, where policies are designed with those most affected at the center. So this is not only possible, it's imperative. We need to be seeing these and seeing how we can respond and continue to support women. And I know Canada has articulated strong national commitments to addressing gender-based violence and most notably through the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence and its broader human rights framework. So, however, global leadership requires more than policy architecture. It requires equitable outcomes. Next slide, please. So our policy architecture in Canada is widely recognized as progressive, reflected in framework, as I mentioned, in the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence, and its international commitment under the Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Sustainable Development Goals, especially Goal 5. So yet, as Black feminist scholars remind us that intersectionality must be measurable and not merely symbolic, I want to highlight the importance of moving beyond intentions to tangible outcome. Again, as highlighted by my previous colleagues, we've seen how sometimes structural barriers impact women when they're trying to access services and support. And I want to especially highlight the Ujima principles, the Afrocentric praxis, and highlight the collective responsibility, that it's all our responsibility when it comes to ensuring that women are accessing safe services. The access to services is barrier free as much as possible. Next slide, please. So when we look at this, it's important for us to make sure that we situate gender-based violence within structural context, where we address colonial legacies and how they continue to shape institutions, where they continue to impact justice, they continue to impact health. We continue to see anti-Black racism and how it impacts access to healthcare. We continue to see anti-Brown racism and all these pieces that impact how women access services and support. We earlier heard about how migration and how spousal sponsorship impacts women and how they access services, criminalization at different levels, whether it's criminalization for women living with HIV, women that have gone through genital cutting, and how that looks like when they try to access services because they're fleeing from gender-based violence. So migration precarity, particularly tied to sponsorship or temporary status, intensifies vulnerability, and recognizing the structural dimensions aligns with both decolonial analysis and international human rights approaches. Next slide, please. So how does this look like at the policy level? So even though Canada acknowledges the heightened vulnerability faced by racialized women, which include immigration dependency, language barriers, as earlier highlighted, economic precarity of where, it impacts how women access safe houses, where they access shelter, and distrust of justice institutions, where we've seen anti-Black racism impact how they do their reporting, because we do know sometimes women report violence and they end up being criminalized themselves. So, you're caught between a hard place and a rock. So this has been increased investment there has been increased investment in culturally specific organizations and community-led prevention initiatives, as we've heard with the Care Cascade being done at Women's Health, Women's Hands. Roots Community Services have also, where I work, have been seeing a lot of work as well in addressing gender-based violence from cultural responsive practices. We've seen other organizations like Uzima. We've seen Strengthening Families Initiative Pathway to Healing in Montreal, among others. And importantly, gender-based violence policy has been aligned with broader anti-racism strategies, signaling recognition of structural inequities across systems. So at least Canada does recognize the importance of these intersecting pieces and looks at how it continues to address access to services and support, and try to federally at least embed these intersections within the policies that are being designed. Next slide, please. So despite the strong intersectional frameworks, race disaggregated data on gender-based violence remains inconsistent across sectors and provinces. So even though we have the intersectional lens and we are utilizing this, Canada has been lacking when it comes to collecting race-based data, of which impacts how we align programs. It impacts how we try to respond to the needs of the community. We see justice systems records often lack standardized racial identifiers, rendering the experiences of racialized women and gender diverse individuals particularly invisible. So because gender-based analysis plus depends on intersectional data, these gaps limit the effectiveness and equity of policy responses. So as you can see in this beautiful diagram, we highlight the importance of using the engagement, governance, access, and protection, the EGAP framework developed by Black Health Equity Canada, which offers a structured approach where engagement ensures commitments, communities help define priorities, governance establishes oversight and accountability, as Ali highlighted the Ujima principle. Access enables communities to benefit from the data collected about them, and protection safeguards sensitive information, particularly for survivors of violence. So this is an invitation for the GBA plus framework to utilize the EGAP framework to strengthen structural accountability and ensure GBV policies are community informed. So unless we listening to community, we are looking at what the needs are for community. It remains difficult for us to advance the policies that are already in existence. And one of the challenges that we have in Canada is not nationally, we do have these policies. However, when it comes to provinces and territories, the challenge becomes of how we implement them at these levels. Next slide, please. So gender-based violence must be understood within its broader structural context. So as many women face significant barriers when seeking justice, women fear deportation. They fear they are employer dependency of where you do not want to leave your job if you have temporary work visas, because that is going to impact your status. We've seen women that face language barriers, as Ali highlighted by Zayana, making sure that we are reaching out to women, we're inputting structures in place that they can be able to access services with as limited barriers as possible. And this I want to highlight when, again, when immigration is tied to sponsorship or employer permits or temporary residence, or where women are facing economic barriers. And one of the things that we've been seeing is the access to accessible housing, like housing has been one of the challenges for women fleeing violence, and that continues to make them vulnerable and fearful of accessing services and supports because they don't want to leave where they're already feeling safe and comfortable. Well, not necessarily comfortable, but where at least they have a roof over their head, or where they know that their children have a place to stay, where they're not exposed or fearful of child welfare coming into their lives. So this is to highlight integrating gender, race, and migration responsive policies will strengthen an equitable system of safety and justice and align with international human rights commitments. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? So first, we have to look at funding inequities that remain significant. We do know that many Black, Indigenous, and racialized-led organizations operate with smaller budgets and shorter funding cycles than mainstream agencies. And this constrains their ability to sustain prevention programs and long-term survivor support. So this is an invitation for government and policy shift of where organizations that are responding and working from culturally responsive frameworks are not seen as additions. They should be viewed as core and should be receiving core funding to ensure that programs are not just running for 1 year, for 3 years, but there is sustainability and making sure that people can continue to tap into services and support. And case in point, the care cascade that was presented earlier. The second, there is a gap in culturally responsive services. While awareness has grown, many mainstream institutions still lack consistent anti-racism training, leadership representation, and culturally grounded risk assessment tools that reflect the realities of diverse communities. We know there is issues with trust, and as there should be within our communities, of where they're hesitant to access services and support until they put out the feelers and check the organizations to see if they're actually being heard, if they're actually being validated, and how that looked like. Third, there is justice system limitations that continue to affect trust and accessibility. Again, we continuously see women, when they report, they're criminalized themselves, whether it was because of language barrier or whether it was because the story turned. For women living with HIV, there is fear of being criminalized on the double, and where the threats are because you're living with HIV, then I'm going to report you and all that. So women are fearful of reporting. So this limited transparency around racial disparities in gender-based violence case processing and outcomes makes it difficult to access whether systems are working equitably. And finally, as I highlighted again, and I can't hammer this enough, is the data limitations, which remain a critical barrier. Without robust race and migration disaggregated data, it becomes difficult to identify patterns of harm or evaluate whether interventions are reaching those most affected. And I do want to, highlight Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, which is not just a performative framework. It must translate into measurable equity outcomes. So we can't continuously say that, we're seeing intersections here and there, and this is how people are facing these limitations or these barriers to accessing services. It's important for us to remember sometimes the systems have not been built for racialized women in accessing services and supports, and we need to shift how that looks like. Maybe by adding other bricks and building a little bit more, or dismantling some of the ones that are not working and recreating and rebuilding. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? So we invite in the decolonizing lenses in response to the structural gaps. So a decolonizing approach offers an important policy direction for strengthening gender-based violence responses. Rather than focusing solely on institutional reform from the top down, it emphasizes shifting power toward communities that are mostly directly affected. So this includes supporting community-led organizations to design and govern prevention and response model, ensuring interventions are culturally grounded and responsive to lived realities. Again, within the Canadian system, we are very quick at responding when things are in crisis, but very limited work is being done in prevention mode. So also putting more effort in us creating prevention interventions. So strengthening early intervention and trust within community is also critical. Investments in culturally responsive programming delivered by trusted local organizations like Roots Community Services, Women's Health, and Women's Hands can improve access to support and prevention efforts. So a decolonizing framework expands how justice is conceptualized in addition to formal legal system, and looks at restorative and transformative approaches and can support survivor healing and accountability. And again, of course, sustainable funding. Sustainable funding has to take place so that we ensure that we're working and protecting survivors and victims, as I highlighted. Next slide, please. So I figured, it's going to be beautiful to have this beautiful picture in how it shows how decolonizing and community-centered policy directions look like. And you can see here we're shifting power back into the community, and this is where we're ensuring that risk-based data is being collected. Community is at the core of informing policies. We're strengthening early intervention and trust. And how does that look like? We're engaging boys and men in responding to gender-based violence. We're shifting past crises and investing in prevention. You can clearly see my health background there in insisting on prevention measures. We have to ensure that we're sustaining culturally grounded leadership, because this is not just an other than, it's core to the work that we're doing and how we're responding. And again, expanding the definition of justice. How does this look like? Are we also looking at are we looking at justice where we're involving families, where we're looking at healing, where we're digging a little bit deeper and looking at the root causes of gender-based violence that are tied to structural gaps such as anti-Black racism, policing and carrying immigration policies and how they shape people's lives, lack of accessible housing, and all that, and how that looks like. Next slide, please. So in this last slide, I want to leave folks with some critical reflective pieces of where I want to highlight that Canada's gender-based violence strategies show structural sophistication, but gaps remain. Intersectionality without accountability can be symbolic. Cultural responsiveness without sustainable funding can fragment services, and justice access without immigration reform leaves survivors behind. So equity isn't assumed, it must be measured. And the next phase of leadership calls for data justice, colonial policy design, and accountability grounded in racialized and Black feminist frameworks. The scaffolding is there, yes. The challenge now is turning commitment into measurable equity for all women, and especially racialized and Black women. So as Dennis Brooks reminds us, I want to leave you with this quote: if it's not in policy, the likelihood of taking root, taking hold, and making a change is very slim. So as we shift, I want to hand over to Mami to lead the Q&A and continue this critical conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marcy. And thank you to all our panelists and audience for joining Women's Health and Women's Hands in today's enlightening discussion on the prevention of gender-based violence and the response necessary to support the achievement of the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. Here are our key takeaways. 1. Migration-related vulnerability is structural, layered, and gendered. 2. Human rights provide the normative foundation for care. 3. Trauma-informed, anti-racist, and equity-oriented practice is a professional obligation. 4. Legal duties must be balanced with autonomy and dignity. 5. Safety, confidentiality, and respect are non-negotiable. 6. Justice requires both bedside care and system change. And lastly, service innovation like the GBV care Cascade model cannot compensate for structural under-resourcing. So now we will open the floor to questions from our attendees. You can either type your questions in the chat box or you can raise your hand to ask verbally. Bill Keys, you can go ahead and ask your question or state.
Thank you. While our audience warms up, here it's pretty icy in Montreal. I was just wondering, Zayana and Mercy, if you were able to talk to us about the approach, that you have put forward in terms of reaching out to healthcare professionals. So my perspective today with you as a complementary is to look at how do we make sure that the work you do, the way you inform your work, is resonating within the clinical perspectives and our OBGYNs, nurses, midwives, social workers, psychologists. We need to think of in a way synchronizing and supporting each other in the ways that we do our work. So maybe Mercy and Zayana, you wanted to sort of share that? what is your perspective on reaching out and sharing that expertise, and how does it work so that we can provide safe care and complete care to women exposed to GBV? Especially the word that you were saying about, when are we comfortable in making sure that, they have um, moved away from, if ever that is what we want, depending on their readiness, from being a victim to a survivor to no labels to autonomy. Those are very baby steps. And that's, you're providing your best practices that way.
Thank you, Professor Belkis. I think for me, it's also looking at the spaces we create for healing. Because often we do move through the motions of all these pieces, but I'll speak for Black women as a Black woman, and my working with Black women and how that have manifested. Often, Black women carry a lot of guilt. The code of silence is very strong, and the shaming is extremely strong, of where we don't create spaces and room to talk about gender-based violence and how it manifests within our lives. So looking at creating spaces, and when we talk about cultural responses, it's really inviting space and creating spaces where women can gather and be able to talk about those lived experiences, right? It's for me, as a researcher, is just moving past the matrix and actually start collecting and listening to people's stories and how that shaped, because we do have to break the cycles at some point. I also draw from my own cultural experiences of where when I look at how during my grandfather's time when he was alive, and looking at how he interfered if there was any domestic dispute, it would be inviting a council of elders. It's inviting other community members to be part of these conversations to unpack these disputes. It's moving from the individualistic models of how we respond to gender-based violence. Because in our communities, often we talk about, if there's a marriage, it's a celebration of not just the two people, it's a celebration of the two families, it's a celebration of community. So when we do have gender-based violence, we need to be responding from that perspective too. It's a communal problem. It's not just for the two people, and digging deeper to look at what are the root causes, why are we seeing this? And often when we, at Roots Community Services, we do have a program that talks about Black men speak up. And when they do encounter in these spaces, it's talking about the frustrations that they have been encountering, whether it's through anti-Black racism through work, it's being cutted on your way to work and all those pieces. So you bring those frustrations back home because there's nowhere else for you to vent or take them out. So when we're creating prevention programs that are also encompassing men, where we are decolonizing how we respond to gender-based violence, not just from a crisis perspective, but where we're also inviting the men and the boys to be able to be part of these conversations. And I think we'll be doing something and shifting beyond the labels to where we are healing, not just for the women, but healing as a community, and where we're also rebuilding families.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mercy. I don't know if Zayana wanted to complete, but I see that.
Yeah, we have a question, or Rangari has her hand raised, so.
Oh, I actually don't have a question. I was going to respond to your question, Bill Kister. I'm not a panelist, but when the program at Women's Health was funded, it was funded for us to develop a promising practice. And we've been running it as a pilot so that we can capture all the evidence, all the aspects that we are developing, so that we can actually then prepare for broader rollouts. So reaching other healthcare providers is part of the larger rollout that we are going to be planning for after the piloting is over. So hopefully we are going to start changing systems rather than having a best practice at women's health that doesn't reach anywhere else. So this is funded as a promising practice that can be rolled out as an intervention. Once we have developed the intervention itself, we have all the related toolkit materials, then prepare for broader rollout, and hopefully we'll reach those OB-GYNs and all the social workers and all the other healthcare providers. So I thought I'd just put that on the table to respond to your question.
Thank you, Wangari, and it really makes sense, especially when we look at women's health and women's health in terms of one of the models that we would like to make sure that the clinical professionals are able to understand the expertise that exists in organizations such as yours. And I think, Zayana, you were definitely presenting some of those, like in one of your first slides, you were showing the various examples that Wanger is referring to. And I guess that you are accounting for that interdisciplinary, intersectoral, intersectional approach in addressing the needs.
So we do have one comment in the chat box from Chantal. She says, the best way is to fight and break silence of women who have experience of GBV. The storytelling is the way of education, sharing and empowering to get out of the closet and also healing. And we have two other folks who have raised their hands. We have Zayana, who can go ahead if you'd like.
So I'll emphasize on what Professor Bilquis had asked. So in terms of our broader rollout, within the first year of the pilot, so January of last year, after already being implemented for a few months, the start of the new year, I sent out a mass email to over 50 different organizations, police services, Focus 22, CAMH, hospitals, West Neighborhood House, Center for Spanish-Speaking Individuals, different churches and different organizations, and just telling them what the services were. And a lot of our referrals and partners have come from that actual email. So we have partnerships with Focus 22. We have partnerships with North York General Hospital through Dr. Angela, which is one of the only doctors within Ontario. There's only 2 doctors in all of Canada that offer FGM supports. Dr. Angela is one of them, and she's the only one in Ontario. The next one is in Montreal. We also have partnerships with West Neighborhood House, Center for Spanish-Speaking Individuals. So especially since English has the least amount of letters and least amount of words out of any language, even with translation services, a lot of times when you hear them saying, I just can't find a word, is because there is no word. In English, for them to express, even with translation, there's no word to express how great of an experience and difficult of an experience that they've had with gender-based violence. So places like Center for Spanish-Speaking Individuals has been a great partnership that we've had, because when we have individuals come in, we do a meeting introduction between the two in organizations, between myself as well as the Center for Spanish-Speaking Individuals, with the client's permission, to be able to warm transfer them over. We can still support them with certain things, but in terms of them sharing their story and being able to share it in a way where someone's able to fully understand how severe their experience was, because it's not just a translation of, oh, that it was really bad, because that's probably the only word that we can find in English. A Spanish individual that also speaks Spanish is able to understand, like, this was a massive amount of abuse and experience that they've experienced. So being able to culturally have those different connections with South Asian organizations as well, with different African, Black, and Caribbean organizations, even though Women's Health and Women's Hands supports those communities, there's organizations that specifically work with Spanish people, specifically work with South Asians, specifically work with Africans, specifically work with Black. So if someone's from Uganda, we can find a Ugandan service, because we also ask them in the first meeting if they're looking for psychotherapy and things like, are you looking for someone that is culturally identifying with you. And for many individuals, they are. For many individuals, they're shocked when I ask them if they're looking for a man or a woman or someone that culturally identifies with them, because a lot of individuals never ask them that. They just look for whoever is available and then send them over on their way. But then also allowing them to know that at any time within service, if you ever feel like a referral I've sent you to is no longer working for you, you can ask them for a referral, or you can come back to me and ask me to send you to a new referral person. Even if at any time you feel like I'm not providing you the services that you need, you can always ask me to refer you out as well. So giving them that full autonomy over their care, and as well as the holistic aspect of our case management, we're able to meet the clients where they are. If there's certain things that clients need within a session before it starts, in the middle, or at the end, we learn that within the first few sessions, and that's built into their case management and counseling sessions as well. So every individual person that seeks support from the Cascade has their own unique experience with the Cascade, because it's always built towards their need.
Thank you for sharing that, Diana. Bill Case also mentioned in the chat, she has a question: who holds responsibility for preventing and responding to GBV within our health and social system, and how accountable are these actors in practice? And that's posed to Wangari, Mercy, and Diana.
I was wondering, Mercy, if in terms of accountability, you would like to sort of share your thoughts, when we talk about, so Wangari mentioned that, we need to have this system change approach, and I totally agree with that. From your perspective, how do you see that we exercise our responsibility and our accountability to that, right? So rather than being systems needs to be changed, which is important, how do we sort of work that out in terms of being proactive actors?
I think that accountability and responsibility part is already happening in how we are responding. So we are responding to the conversations themselves, to access of services and support. Again, just throwing it back to the care cascade that is already proactively shifting how we have been looking at gender-based violence and putting the responses that are needed there. From our end on roots community services, we do past that we move to making sure that the programming that we're putting in place are also looking at entrepreneurship, for example, opportunities for survivors and victims, so that there is economic independence, right? So from an organizational perspective, that is putting out the accountability piece of making sure that we are empowering women in being financially independent, but also in holding, how do we, in having the difficult conversations. So harm is happening within the households. So, creating spaces where we can have these conversations within the whole, for both the perpetrators, for the survivors themselves, and the children that continue to watch the violence and sometimes mirror that violence. So for me, that is a perspective of social justice that includes that sees the family as whole, and where we making sure that we're not just responding to the now, we are also putting measures in place to make sure that we are breaking the cycles of violence and how they are showing up.
Yeah, but I think Belkis, for a lot of the, systems accountability is actually grounded in what is in policy, government policy, as well as the policies of those who are delivering the services. And a lot of the time we deal with gender-based violence system-wise as a crisis. So supporting people experiencing GBV consistently and on an ongoing basis can be dealt with crisis funding. There has to be continuous funding for organizations to actually do what they do. And part of the reason why women's health is always participates in CSW activities, it's because we know without the push from communities that are leading this work, governments never make any changes. So there has to be a huge advocacy component around GBV that will continuously force governments to develop better policies, continuously fund programs that are going to support communities or put gender-based programming in the hands of the communities who understand communities. But without the funding, this is not going to happen. So that push all the time to ensure that, we're holding governments accountable, we're holding institutions accountable, has to be a sustained effort. And in particular, if you have come from work around equity and social justice, every step you win is a fight. And we have to keep on sustaining that fight to ensure that we get what is our due.
Yeah, and can I just build after that? I want to look at how we were responding to gender-based violence during COVID time. I don't know where the money came from, but there was money to respond, right? Because we identified that the cases were heightened, and we were now blatantly seeing the violence was in everyone's face because people are in their houses and all that. So there was money that came out to respond during that time. There were measures put in place to respond. However, when COVID, quietened down, then all these supports also, we stopped seeing these supports as well, which is problematic because gender-based violence did not leave us. It still continues to be the silent pandemic that is there. It's still so embedded in society, but also ignored a lot because we just normalize it so much that we not, for funding, when it to Angari's point of funding, we continuously rely on grants, especially, working from culturally responsive organization, we continuously rely on short-term funds that end as soon as, the project is finished, but that continues to create gaps for people when they're trying to access services. I also want to highlight that as part of collective responsibility is the need for us to continue doing community-based research, right? Because with research and with data we're collecting from community, it continues to inform how we structure our programs. It continues to inform how we respond to GBV when we're seeing it within our communities, and also shift our mindset in how things have been done previously to start incorporating, to start centering community responses when it comes to how we are writing or creating programs.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, we do just have 2 minutes remaining. If folks still want to put a question in the chat box or raise their hand, you're free to do so. We have just about 5 minutes left. Mary?
Yeah, just so quickly, thank everyone for a good presentation, very informative. I just wanted to put it out there in terms of, and to any of the speakers, in terms of economic empowerment, how can we be able to empower women to move and be able to kind of, be economically stable and come out of situations whereby, they are dependent. And so any ideas or programming that can be done, or research, like you said, Dr. Watetu, in terms of moving forward to support them, to empower them economically.
I can respond to that. Mir, thank you so much for the question. Yes, so some of I know in Ontario, the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, MCCSS, have some funding for programs that empower women. And the MPP, the Minister Champagne, is big on economic development and empowerment for women. So at Roots Community Services, we do have one program that is called SEED, and this is looking at, because we know women are very they're very entrepreneurship minded, and so we've been trying to create opportunities for them where they can be able to do a 12-week business program of where by the end of it they get a little seed money for them to enhance or start their business. And it is scalable. So again, when we have resources, we're not keeping them to ourselves. To Bilkis' earlier question, we share and expand them across the community. So I'm happy to share that program with anyone that is interested.
There was a question in the chat about whether the slides will be circulated. Are they going to be to the participants?
They should be. From what I recall, Tamilo mentioned that everything will be recorded. So I think that the slides would be shared.
Okay.
If you're interested in getting the slides, I will put an email in the chat. You can send an email and then you can receive it.
A lot of people have already left Tamilola. Is there a way to circulate it to the people who registered for the session, or you didn't collect any email from them?
No problem. I will circulate it to those who registered for the session.
Yeah.
So we just pretty much our time is up. It's now 2:00. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining today's session and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.